On February 14, 2025, a 10-year-old girl saved 3 lives in a blizzard by hearing what no one else could. Her father was driving home after a 12-hour shift, off-duty officer, exhausted. The storm was so violent, visibility collapsed to arm's length. Standard protocol. Don't stop. Keep driving. Get home. But then his daughter Ava heard it, a sound. Faint. Desperate, barely alive. Dad, stop please. He didn't want to. He thought it was the wind. But she wouldn't let it go. So he pulled over, and what they found in the snow, blindfolded, freezing, minutes from death, were 3 puppies. But these weren't random victims. One of them carried a microchip. A microchip registered to a dog named Daisy, a dog Ava's mother had tried to save 2 years earlier before she lost her battle with cancer. A dog the system said was dead. Except Daisy wasn't dead. She was locked in a shed 70 miles away, starving and forgotten. This story has everything: a daughter honoring her mother's unfinished fight, a criminal who thought he'd never get caught, a courtroom in September 2025 where justice finally spoke, and a wooden sign on Brookfield Avenue that now reads, Hope Corner, where love chose to stop. But it also has a question no one wants to answer. How many complaints does it take before the system listens? How many animals have to suffer before cruelty becomes a priority? Ava's mother filed a report in 2022. She had evidence, photographs, testimony, and the case was closed. Marked insufficient evidence. 2 years later, her daughter found Daisy's son buried in a blizzard, blindfolded and left to die. Who was the man behind this? How did a single microchip bring down an illegal breeding operation? And what happened on the 3C? No 2 p.m. in the veterinary emergency room that made everyone believe in miracles again. This is the story they tried to bury in the snow. But one little girl refused to let it disappear. Stay with us because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The blizzard had transformed Brookfield Avenue into a corridor of white violence, where snow didn't fall so much as attack from every direction at once. Visibility collapsed to arm's length. The wind didn't howl, it roared, a relentless mechanical scream that swallowed all other sound. Inside the patrol SUV, Ava's father drove with the practiced calm of someone who had navigated worse roads, worse nights, worse storms. His hands rested steady on the wheel, his eyes scanning the barely visible center line with the methodical focus of an off-duty officer who never truly clocked out. The radio crackled intermittently with traffic advisories and stranded motorist calls, but he didn't respond. He was heading home. That was the plan. That was always the plan after a 12-hour shift. Ava sat in the passenger seat, her breath fogging the window as she pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She was 10 years old and had learned early how to be quiet in her father's world, how to let him think without interruption, how to exist in the space between emergency and exhaustion. But then she heard it. A sound so faint it could have been the wind bending around metal, or the groan of a tree branch weighted with ice. Except it wasn't. It was something else. Something alive. She turned her head sharply, scanning the white void outside. "Dad," she said softly. He didn't respond, eyes locked forward. "Dad," she repeated louder this time. "I heard something." He exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that came before a polite dismissal. "It's the wind, Ava. Plays tricks out here." But she shook her head, already unbuckling her seatbelt before he could stop her. "No, it's not the wind." He pulled over reluctantly, hazard lights casting weak orange pulses into the storm. Standard protocol said don't stop. Standard protocol said whiteout conditions meant zero margin for error. But standard protocol also said listen to your gut. And his daughter had her mother's gut. He stepped out first, shielding his face against the stinging snow, and Ava followed, small boots sinking deep into fresh drifts. She moved toward the sound instinctively, her body leaning forward like a compass needle finding north. And then she saw them, 3 shapes barely distinguishable from the snow itself. Puppies, tiny, trembling, blindfolded with scraps of dark fabric that bit cruelly into their soft heads. They were half buried, their cries weak and disoriented, their bodies already succumbing to hypothermia. Ava's father knelt beside her, his training kicking in before his heart could fully register what he was seeing. Blindfolds weren't accidental. Blindfolds meant intent, meant cruelty, meant someone had brought these animals here to die. His jaw tightened. But Ava wasn't thinking about investigations or evidence chains. She was thinking about the hospital corridor in 2023, where she had stood helpless as monitors beeped slower and slower, as her mother's hand grew colder, as the word, "gone," replaced the word, "stay." She reached down and lifted the weakest puppy, the one whose breathing was barely a flutter, and held it against her chest. "We're not leaving you," she whispered. Behind her, her father was already pulling out his phone, already shifting from father to officer, already realizing this moment wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a case. The Northside Veterinary Emergency Center smelled like antiseptic and wet fur, a sharp sterile scent that clashed with the chaos unfolding in the back examination room. Ava's father carried the weakest puppy through the double doors while two staff members rushed to meet him with towels and heated blankets. His uniform was still damp from the snow, badge catching the fluorescent light in brief metallic flashes as he moved. He gave the veterinarian the details quickly, location, conditions, approximate exposure time, but his voice carried the flat precision of someone filing a report rather than begging for help. That was his mode. Document. Assess, contain emotion. Ava stood beside him, silent and shaking, not from cold but from the weight of proximity to death. Dr. Callahan worked fast, checking vitals, administering subcutaneous fluids, wrapping the puppy in thermal foil. "Severe hypothermia," she said quietly. "Core temp is dangerously low. We'll do what we can, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Ava had heard unfinished sentences before. At 20:47 p.m., the puppy was placed inside a clear oxygen chamber, its tiny chest barely rising. The other two puppies were stable, frightened and malnourished, but stable. This one was different. This one was hovering at the edge. Ava pressed her palm flat against the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she leaned close. "Please don't leave," she whispered. Her father stood a few feet back, arms crossed, watching not just the puppy but his daughter. He saw the hospital corridor in her posture, saw the grief she had carried for 18 months, saw her fighting the same fight again. At 30:02 p.m., something shifted. A small paw, so small it seemed impossible it could hold life, pressed weakly against the inside of the glass. Just once. Just barely. But it was their movement. Intent survival. Dr. Callahan glanced at the monitor and exhaled sharply. "Heart rate's climbing," she said, cautious hope creeping into her voice. Ava's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. Her father uncrossed his arms and stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. This wasn't just a veterinary emergency anymore. This was evidence of deliberate harm, evidence of abandonment, evidence of a crime that required documentation, investigation, and prosecution. He pulled out his notebook, the same one he used for incident reports, and began writing. Fabric type coarse cotton, likely repurposed rag, Hanat-style double wrap suggesting haste or panic. Frost depth around bodies approximately 4 inches, indicating at least 3 hours of exposure. He wasn't just a father watching his daughter save a puppy. He was an officer building a case. And as the puppy's breathing steadied, as its tiny body began to fight back against the cold, Ava realized something her father already knew. Some rescues don't end when the victim is pulled from danger. Some rescues are only the beginning. 3 weeks later, the snow had melted into muddy rivulets along Brookfield Avenue, exposing a landscape that had been buried under winter's erasure. What had once been a featureless white void now revealed trash, tire tracks, and, crucially, evidence. Ava's father returned to the site on a gray morning, this time in full uniform, this time accompanied by 2 other officers and a forensic photographer. The case had been officially opened. File number 2025-02-40AC, Animal Cruelty with Intent. He had recused himself as lead investigator due to family involvement, but he was still present, still involved, still carrying the weight of what his daughter had found and what he now had to prove. The investigation began methodically. Footprints, though degraded, were still faintly visible near the snowbank where the puppies had been buried. A receipt, crumpled and half dissolved, was recovered from a nearby drainage grate. The ink was smeared, but 2 words were still legible: premium pups. A search warrant was filed. Security footage from a gas station a quarter-mile down the road captured a gray pickup truck idling near Brookfield Avenue at 11:47 p.m. on the night of the storm. The license plate was partially obscured, but forensic enhancement revealed enough. The registered owner was a man named Dale Merrick, operating under the business name Midwest Premium Pups, unlicensed, unregulated, uninspected. Ava's father sat in the briefing room as the case details were laid out. He listened silently as the lead investigator described Merrick's operation, a backyard breeding facility running out of a rural property 40 miles outside the city limits. Overbreeding. No veterinary oversight. Animals kept in outdoor kennels year-round. Complaints filed but never followed up. The blindfolds, the investigator explained, were likely used to prevent the puppies from seeing where they were being taken, to reduce noise during transport, to make disposal easier. Cruelty with a purpose. Not rage. Not passion. Calculation. Ava learned the details secondhand, sitting at the kitchen table while her father debriefed with his partner over coffee. She didn't ask questions. She just listened. And as she listened, she realized something that made her stomach turn cold. This wasn't random. This wasn't a stranger. This was a system. A system that had been running unchecked for years. A system that had hurt animals before and would hurt them again unless someone stopped it. Her father saw the realization settle across her face. He wanted to tell her that justice was inevitable, that the system worked, that bad people always got caught, but he couldn't. Because he knew better. He had seen cases stall, seen evidence mishandled, seen plea deals reduce felonies to fines. But this time, he thought, this time would be different. Because this time, the victim had been found alive. This time, there was a witness who refused to forget. This time, the case had a name, a face, and a daughter who wouldn't let him look away. The stakes had escalated. This was no longer just about rescue. It was about accountability. About ensuring that cruelty didn't get to hide behind paperwork and bureaucracy. About proving that even the smallest victims mattered enough to fight for. Ava folded her hands on the table, her voice quiet but firm. "We're going to stop him, right?" Her father looked at her for a long moment, then nodded.
"Yes,"
he said. "YR." Ava's father stood in the archives room of the precinct, surrounded by filing cabinets that smelled like old paper and stale coffee. He was looking for a specific report, one he remembered filing away 2 years ago, one his wife had brought to his attention after spending weeks compiling evidence on her own. She had sat at their kitchen table in 2022. Spreadsheets printed and highlighted, photographs organized in labeled folders, testimony from neighbors who had heard dogs barking at all hours from Merrick's property. She hadn't been a police officer. She had been a school librarian with a stubborn sense of justice and an inability to ignore suffering. He found the file, report number 22-09 AC, filed by Elizabeth Hartman, his wife. The complaint detailed suspected animal neglect and possible illegal breeding operations at the Merrick property. Photographs showed overcrowded kennels, dogs with visible injuries, a pickup truck matching the one recently identified in the current case. The responding officer had noted insufficient evidence for warrant and recommended continued monitoring. The case had been closed pending further complaints. No follow-up, no inspection, no justice. Ava's father sat down heavily in the metal chair, the file open in front of him. He remembered the night she had told him about it. Remembered her frustration. Remembered telling her that the system had procedures, that they couldn't act without solid evidence, that a single complaint wasn't enough. He had believed that, had trusted the system, had moved on to the next case, and then, 6 months later, she had been diagnosed. And 6 months after that she was gone, and the Merrick case had stayed closed. Now, holding the file in his hands, he felt the full weight of what had been left unfinished. His wife had tried to save those animals, had tried to stop Merrick before more damage could be done, and the system, his system, had failed her. He closed the file slowly, his jaw tight. This wasn't just about the puppies Ava had found in the snow. This was about finishing what Elizabeth had started, about honoring a fight she had waged alone while he had stood on the sidelines, trusting protocol over instinct. He brought the file home that night. Ava was sitting on the couch, one of the rescued puppies, now named Lucky, curled in her lap. He set the file on the coffee table between them. "Your mother filed a complaint against Merrick 2 years ago," he said quietly. Ava looked up, confusion flickering across her face. "Mom," he nodded. She spent weeks building a case. She knew something was wrong. She tried to stop him. Ava's hands stilled on Lucky's fur. They didn't listen. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. The silence was confirmation enough. Ava stared at the file, her mother's name printed neatly on the label. She had spent 18 months grieving a loss she couldn't control, a death she couldn't prevent. But this was different. This was something her mother had tried to stop and couldn't. And now, through a storm and a faint cry and a trained officer's daughter who refused to walk away, the fight had returned, not as coincidence, as continuation. "She would have wanted us to finish this," Ava said softly. Her father sat beside her, the weight of regret and resolve settling across his shoulders. "Then we finish it," he said. The veterinary clinic was quiet on the morning of the microchip scan, sunlight filtering through slatted blinds and casting long shadows across the examination table. Lucky, the weakest of the 3 rescued puppies, now thriving after weeks of care, lay calmly as Dr. Callahan passed the scanner over his shoulder blade. The device beeped once, a soft electronic chirp that seemed insignificant. But the number that appeared on the screen froze everyone in the room. Ava's father leaned forward, his expression shifting from casual observation to sharp focus. Dr. Callahan frowned, tapping the screen as if to confirm what she was seeing. "This chip is registered," she said slowly, "to a dog named Daisy." Ava's father felt his pulse spike. He pulled out his phone, scrolling rapidly through the archived case files he had stored there. Daisy. That name. He had seen it before. In his wife's complaint, in the notes she had compiled, in the testimony from a neighbor who had reported seeing a severely malnourished golden retriever chained outside Merrick's property in 2022. A dog that had disappeared shortly after the complaint was filed. A dog Merrick claimed had died of natural causes. "Daisy is Lucky's mother," Dr. Callahan said, her voice quiet but certain. "This puppy is her offspring." The room fell silent. Ava stared at Lucky, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. The puppy she had pulled from the snow, the one whose heartbeat had nearly flatlined in the oxygen chamber, was the son of the dog her mother had tried to save. The connection wasn't coincidence. It was legacy. It was proof that the cruelty hadn't stopped. That Merrick had continued operating, continued breeding, continued harming animals even after being reported. Ava's father sat down slowly, the realization settling like a stone in his chest. His wife had tried to save Daisy, had fought for her, had documented her suffering and demanded intervention, and the system had told her there wasn't enough evidence. Now, 2 years later, Daisy's son had been blindfolded and left to die in a storm. Left to become another casualty in a cycle of cruelty that should have been stopped the first time. He looked at Ava, saw the same understanding dawning in her eyes. "Mom was trying to save his mother," she whispered. He nodded. "And now we're saving him." But it wasn't just about Lucky anymore. If Daisy had been microchipped, if she was still registered, then there was a chance, however slim, that she was still alive, still suffering, still waiting for someone to finish what Elizabeth Hartman had started. Ava's father stood, his decision made. "We need to find Daisy," he said. Dr. Callahan nodded. "I'll contact the microchip registry. If she's been scanned anywhere, shelter, vet clinic, rescue will know." The search began that afternoon. Phone calls, database queries, cross-referencing medical records. And 3 days later the call came. Daisy had been scanned at a rural animal control facility 70 miles away. She had been surrendered anonymously, emaciated and pregnant, just weeks before Lucky and his siblings were found in the snow. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Ava's father ended the call and looked at his daughter. "We found her," he said quietly. Ava's eyes filled with tears. "Mom almost saved her," she whispered. "Now we will." And in that moment, the case shifted again. It wasn't just about justice for Lucky. It wasn't just about stopping Merrick. It was about completing a rescue that had started 2 years ago, in a kitchen lit by lamplight, with a woman who refused to ignore suffering and a system that had ignored her. The smallest chip had revealed the biggest truth: this fight had never ended. It had only waited for the right people to pick it up again. The rural farm raid happened on a cold February morning in 2025, the kind of morning where frost clung stubbornly to fence posts and breath turned to vapor in the still air. 3 county vehicles rolled up the gravel driveway toward Merrick's property, followed by animal control vans and a veterinary emergency team. Ava's father sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, technically present only as a consulting officer, but his hands were clenched tight around the door handle. He had waited 2 years for this moment. His wife had waited longer. The property was worse than the photographs suggested. Kennels constructed from rusted chain link and rotting wood lined the back acre, many of them overcrowded with dogs in various states of neglect. The stench hit them before they even opened the van doors, a sour, acrid mix of waste, decay, and desperation. Officers moved quickly, documenting conditions, photographing injuries, securing evidence. Merrick stood on the porch, arms crossed, face hard with defiance. "I run a legal business," he said flatly. "You got no right." The lead investigator held up the warrant. "We have every right." Ava's father didn't wait for the argument to play out. He moved past the kennels toward a smaller structure at the far edge of the property, a shed with a single cracked window and a padlocked door. Something about it pulled at him, instinct honed over years of reading crime scenes. He motioned to an officer who cut the lock with bolt cutters. The door swung open. Inside, lying on a pile of filthy blankets, was Daisy. She was skeletal, her golden coat matted and dull, her eyes clouded with exhaustion. But she was alive. She lifted her head slowly when the light spilled in, not with fear, but with something closer to resignation. As if she had stopped believing rescue was possible, Ava's father knelt beside her, his voice low and steady. "It's okay, girl. You're safe now." Daisy didn't move, didn't wag her tail, didn't show recognition. She simply stared at him with the hollow gaze of an animal that had survived too long without hope. The veterinary team moved in quickly, administering fluids, checking vitals, preparing her for transport. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from untreated infections, but she was stable enough to move. Stable enough to survive. As they loaded her into the transport van, Ava's father stood in the doorway of that shed, staring at the space where she had been kept. His wife had known, had tried to save her, had filed the complaint, gathered the evidence, fought the system. And the system had let Daisy stay here, had let her suffer for 2 more years, had let her give birth to puppies that were then blindfolded and abandoned in a storm. The rage he felt wasn't loud, it was cold, precise. The kind of anger that didn't shout but acted. He turned back toward Merrick, who was now being led toward a police vehicle in handcuffs. Their eyes met briefly. Merrick's face showed no remorse, no shame, only irritation. Ava's father didn't say anything, didn't need to. The evidence would speak louder than any accusation. Later that afternoon, Daisy was transferred to the Dane County Animal Sanctuary, a private facility specializing in rehabilitation for abused animals. Ava and her father visited her the next day. She was lying in a soft bed in a climate-controlled recovery room, an IV line still attached to her leg, her breathing slow and steady. Ava sat beside her, tears streaming silently down her face. "Mom tried to save you," she whispered. "I'm so sorry it took this long." Daisy's eyes fluttered open. For the first time since her rescue, her tail moved, just barely, just once, but it moved. Ava's father stood in the doorway, watching his daughter complete the rescue his wife had started. Redemption wasn't loud. It didn't come with fanfare. It came in quiet moments like this, where survival met grace and the fight finally ended not in loss but in life. Daisy was never gone. She had been waiting for someone to remember, waiting for someone to come back. And now, finally, she was free. September 3, 2025. Courtroom 2B smelled like old wood and fresh tension. Ava's father sat in the third row, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, button-down shirt, no badge. He had testified the day before, presenting evidence as Officer Hartman, but today he was just a father, just a man watching the system he had spent his career trusting finally prove it could work. Beside him sat Ava, wearing the same scarf her mother had given her 2 Christmases ago. She held Lucky's adoption papers in her lap, folded carefully, like a talisman. The courtroom was quiet in the way only courtrooms can be, thick with anticipation, heavy with consequence. Dale Merrick sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a public defender who looked exhausted. Merrick's face was unreadable, not defiant, not remorseful, just blank, as if the weight of what he had done hadn't yet registered, or perhaps never would. The prosecution had built an airtight case. Photographs of the overcrowded kennels, veterinary testimony detailing malnutrition, untreated injuries, and systemic neglect. Security footage placing Merrick's truck near Brookfield Avenue on the night of the storm. Forensic analysis of the blindfolds, matching fabric samples found on his property, And the microchip evidence, the single piece of data that connected Daisy to Lucky, that proved the cruelty hadn't been isolated but generational. The prosecutor stood, her voice clear and unwavering. Your Honor, the evidence demonstrates a pattern of deliberate cruelty. This was not neglect born of ignorance. This was calculated harm. The defendant operated an illegal breeding facility, subjected animals to inhumane conditions, and when those animals became inconvenient, he disposed of them. 3 puppies were blindfolded and abandoned in a blizzard. 1 nearly died. Their mother, Daisy, spent 2 years confined in conditions so severe they constitute torture under state law. She paused, letting the words settle. Animals are not disposable property. They are sentient beings protected under law, and the law demands accountability. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, nodded slowly. She had reviewed the evidence extensively, had seen the photographs, had read the veterinary reports, had listened to the testimony. Now she looked directly at Merrick. Mr. Merrick, you have been found guilty on multiple counts of animal cruelty, operating an unlicensed breeding facility, and endangerment. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? Merrick glanced at his lawyer, then shook his head. No, Your Honor. The judge's expression hardened. Then I will. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, her voice measured but unyielding. She detailed the evidence. She described the suffering. She addressed the broader implications of allowing such cruelty to go unchecked. This court recognizes that animals depend entirely on human compassion and responsibility. When that responsibility is violated, the consequences must reflect the severity of the harm. You did not simply neglect these animals. You systematically abused them. You profited from their suffering, and when they could no longer serve your purposes, you attempted to erase them. She paused, removing her glasses. You failed. The courtroom held its breath. I hereby sentence you to 3 years in county jail, followed by 5 years of probation. You are permanently banned from owning, breeding, or housing animals. You will pay restitution to cover the medical care of the rescued animals, as well as a fine of $50,000. The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the room like a punctuation mark on years of suffering. Ava exhaled shakily. Her father squeezed her hand. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was closure. The system, the same system that had failed his wife, that had let Daisy suffer, that had delayed justice, had finally worked. Slowly, imperfectly, but it had worked. As they left the courtroom, Ava paused in the hallway. Mom would have wanted to be here, she said quietly. Her father nodded. She is, he said. Every piece of evidence. Every witness statement. She's in all of it. Ava looked up at him, eyes red but steady. We finished her fight. He pulled her into a hug, the kind of hug that held grief and pride in equal measure. We did, he whispered. We did. The judge's chambers were quieter than the courtroom, the kind of space where voices carried weight without needing volume. After the sentencing, the judge had requested a brief recess and invited Ava to provide a victim impact statement. It wasn't required. Ava wasn't the legal victim. But the judge had read the case file thoroughly, had seen the connection between the complaint filed by Elizabeth Hartman and the rescue performed by her daughter, and had decided that this child's voice deserved to be heard. Not just documented. Heard. Ava sat in a chair that felt too big, her feet barely touching the floor. Her father sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The judge sat across from them, her expression softer now, the courtroom severity replaced with something closer to empathy. Ava, she said gently, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to. But if you do, I'll listen. Ava nodded slowly. She had been quiet for 18 months, quiet in the hospital corridor, quiet at the funeral, quiet through the grief that had settled into her bones like winter cold. But today, she wasn't going to be quiet. She took a breath, her voice small but steady. When my mom was sick, I couldn't do anything. I just had to sit there and watch. The doctors tried, but she kept getting worse, and I didn't know how to help. I felt like I was useless. Her hands tightened around the edge of her chair. And then, in the storm, I heard Lucky crying. And I thought maybe I could help this time. Maybe I could save someone. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. I didn't know he was connected to my mom's case. I didn't know she had tried to save his mother. But when I found out, I realized she was still teaching me. still showing me that even when the world is terrible, you don't just walk away. The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes intent. Your mother filed a complaint 2 years ago, didn't she? Ava nodded. She tried to stop him. She did everything right, but nobody listened. There was no accusation in her tone, just fact, cold, undeniable fact. And because nobody listened, Daisy stayed there, and Lucky almost died. Her voice grew quieter but somehow stronger. I couldn't save my mom, but I could save him. And I could make sure the person who hurt him couldn't hurt anyone else. The room was silent. The judge removed her glasses, folding them carefully in her hands. Ava, what you did, what you and your father did, matters more than you may realize. You didn't just save Lucky. You gave voice to every animal that suffered on that property. You completed your mother's work. And in doing so, you ensured that her fight wasn't forgotten. Ava's tears fell freely now, but she didn't wipe them away. I just didn't want him to be left behind, she whispered, like she was. Her father's hand tightened on her shoulder. The judge stood slowly, moving around the desk to kneel in front of Ava. Your mother wasn't left behind, she said gently. She's in every piece of evidence, in every law that protected Lucky, in every word of the sentence I just delivered, and most of all, she's in you. Ava looked up, meeting the judge's eyes. Do you think she would be proud? The judge smiled. I know she would be. Later, back in the courtroom, the judge reconvened briefly to acknowledge Ava's statement on the record. She summarized it carefully, ensuring that Ava's words became part of the permanent case file, that they would exist not as a footnote but as testimony, as proof that even the smallest voices could shift the scales of justice. When the gavel struck for the final time, Ava stood. She wasn't the frightened girl who had pulled a dying puppy from the snow. She was someone who had learned that helplessness wasn't permanent. That action could heal grief. That speaking, even when your voice shook, could change the world. Her father walked beside her as they left the courthouse, the autumn sun warm on their faces. You okay? He asked. She nodded. I think so. He didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. They had done what needed to be done. Together, for Elizabeth, for Daisy, for Lucky, and for every victim who had ever been left behind. October 20, 2025, the Dane County Animal Sanctuary sat on 12 acres of rolling grassland, bordered by oak trees that had turned gold and crimson under the autumn sky. It wasn't a loud place. There were no barking kennels, no concrete runs, no cages stacked floor to ceiling, just open spaces, quiet recovery rooms, and the steady presence of people who had devoted their lives to repairing what cruelty had broken. Ava and her father arrived just after noon, the sunlight soft and forgiving as they walked toward the main building. Ava carried Lucky in her arms. He was nearly full, grown now, healthy and bright-eyed, his coat glossy from proper care. But today wasn't about Lucky. Today was about Daisy. They found her in the outdoor rehabilitation yard, lying beneath a tree, her head resting on her paws. She had gained weight over the past 8 months, her ribs no longer visible, her coat restored to its natural golden shine. But her eyes still carried the memory of what she had survived, the kind of wariness that didn't vanish with food and shelter alone. Ava set Lucky down. For a moment, the puppy stood still, sniffing the air, his head tilted slightly. And then, as if pulled by something deeper than scent or sight, he walked toward Daisy. She lifted her head slowly, watching him approach. Her tail moved, just once. Just barely. But it moved. Lucky reached her and pressed his nose against hers, a soft, tentative greeting. Daisy exhaled slowly, her body relaxing in a way it hadn't since her rescue. She didn't leap up, didn't bark, didn't play. But she recognized him, mother and son, separated by cruelty, reunited by persistence. Ava's father stood beside her, his throat tight. She knows, he said quietly. Ava nodded, unable to speak. The sanctuary director approached, holding a clipboard and a pen. Are you ready? She asked gently. Ava's father nodded. We're ready. The adoption paperwork was simple. Name, address, veterinary contact, acknowledgement of responsibility. But as he signed his name on the final line, not as Officer Hartman, but as David Hartman, guardian, he felt the full weight of what this moment represented. His wife had fought for Daisy, had documented her suffering, had demanded intervention, and when the system had failed, she hadn't stopped caring. She had simply run out of time. Now, 2 years later, her husband and daughter were finishing what she had started. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through the quiet, steady act of providing safety to a dog who had never known it. Daisy was led gently toward them, a new collar around her neck, soft, adjustable, nothing like the chain she had worn for years. She hesitated at the threshold between the yard and the driveway, as if afraid to believe this was real. Ava knelt down, extending her hand slowly. "You're coming home," she whispered. "You're safe now." Daisy stepped forward, her nose brushing Ava's palm. And then, for the first time since her rescue, she wagged her tail fully. Not out of fear, not out of submission. Out of trust. The drive home was quiet. Daisy sat in the back seat beside Lucky, her head resting against the window. Ava watched them in the rearview mirror, a small smile on her face. "4 dogs," her father said, glancing at her. "That's a full house." Ava laughed softly. "Mom would have loved it," he smiled. "She would have insisted on 5. When they arrived home, Daisy stepped cautiously into the house, her eyes scanning every corner, every sound. But there was no chain, no kennel, no locked shed, just soft beds, warm light, and the gentle presence of people who had chosen her. Ava sat on the floor, and Daisy lowered herself beside her, her head resting in Ava's lap. "We didn't forget you?" Ava whispered. "Mom didn't forget you." Daisy's eyes closed slowly, her breathing deep and even. For the first time in years, she slept without fear. Ava's father stood in the doorway, watching his daughter and the dog his wife had fought for. Justice had been served in a courtroom. But healing, true healing, was happening here, in the quiet, in the presence of safety, in the simple, profound act of a dog finally allowed to rest. He thought of Elizabeth. Thought of the nights she had stayed up organizing evidence. The frustration in her voice when the complaint had been dismissed. The hope she had carried even when the system had let her down. She hadn't lived to see this moment, but she had made it possible. Adoption Day wasn't just about signing papers. It was about honoring a promise, about ensuring that the fight for the voiceless didn't end when the fighter was gone. It was about love that persisted beyond loss, and as Daisy's breathing deepened into true, peaceful sleep, David Hartman knew his wife's legacy wasn't defined by what she hadn't finished. It was defined by what they had completed together. A January 18, 2026, Brookfield Avenue looked nothing like it had a year ago. The snow had melted weeks earlier, leaving behind clear pavement and dormant grass that would green again come spring. Sunlight poured down from a pale blue sky, the kind of light that felt gentle rather than harsh, the kind that made everything look softer, kinder. Ava stood on the shoulder of the road, her hands tucked into the pockets of her mother's scarf, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. Beside her stood her father, dressed in jeans and a thick jacket, no uniform, no badge. Just a man, just a father, and around them, 4 dogs played freely, Lucky, Daisy, and the 2 other puppies rescued from the storm, now full-grown and thriving. A wooden sign had been installed at the exact spot where Ava had first heard Lucky's cry. It was simple, hand-carved, stained a deep walnut brown. The words were painted in white, Hope Corner, where love chose to stop. Beneath it, in smaller letters, in memory of Elizabeth Hartman, who taught us to listen. The sign had been Ava's idea. Her father had built it, and the city council had approved its installation without hesitation. It wasn't a memorial in the traditional sense. It wasn't about mourning. It was about action. About the choice to stop when the world said keep driving. About the refusal to accept that cruelty was inevitable or that one person couldn't make a difference. Ava ran her fingers along the edge of the sign, tracing the letters of her mother's name. "She would have stopped too," she said quietly. Her father nodded. "She did stop. Just not here. She stopped when she filed that complaint. When she refused to let Daisy be forgotten." He paused, looking at Daisy, who was lying contentedly in a patch of sunlight. "We just finished the stop she started." Ava smiled. "Do you think other people will stop here?" Her father considered the question. "I think some will, and that's enough." They had received letters over the past year. From families who had adopted the other rescued dogs. From activists who had used the case as a rallying point for stronger animal protection laws. From students who had studied the case in ethics classes. From a neighboring county that had shut down 2 more illegal breeding operations after the Merrick conviction set legal precedent. The ripple effect of one 10-year-old girl hearing a cry in a storm had reached farther than anyone had anticipated. But for Ava, It wasn't about the letters or the laws or the recognition. It was about standing here, in this exact spot, and knowing that she had refused to be helpless. That she had chosen action over silence. That she had honored her mother not by grieving endlessly, but by continuing the work her mother had believed in. Lucky bounded over, tail wagging, and nudged Ava's leg with his nose. She laughed and knelt down, scratching behind his ears. "You know what today is, don't you?" she said softly. Lucky tilted his head, tongue lolling happily. "1 year since you almost died. 1 year since we became a family." Her father crouched beside her, resting a hand on Lucky's back. "He's a fighter," he said, "just like you." Ava looked up at him, her eyes serious. "Do you think Mom knows?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the sign, at the dogs, at his daughter, this fierce, compassionate girl who had turned grief into purpose. "I think she knows," he said finally. "I think she's been with us the whole time." A car slowed as it passed, the driver glancing at the sign, then at the family standing beside it. The driver didn't stop. But the glance was enough. A moment of awareness, a seed planted. That was all Hope required. Not grand gestures, just the willingness to see, to acknowledge, to care. Ava stood, brushing snow from her jeans. "We should get home," she said. "It's getting cold." Her father nodded, but he didn't move immediately. He took one last look at the spot where his daughter had changed everything. Where a dog's faint cry had pierced a storm. Where a choice had been made. Where justice had begun. As they walked back to the car, Daisy trotted beside Ava, her gait steady and strong. She was no longer the skeletal, hollow-eyed dog rescued from a shed. She was whole, not because the past had been erased, but because the present had been rebuilt with patience, care, and love. Ava opened the car door, and the dogs jumped in one by one. Her father started the engine, the heater humming to life. As they pulled away from Hope Corner, Ava looked back through the rear window. The sign stood firm, visible and clear, a marker not of tragedy but of transformation. "We did it," she said quietly. Her father glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "We did." And as Brookfield Avenue disappeared behind them, Ava felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not closure, not relief, but peace. The kind that comes when you know you've fought for something that mattered. When you've turned pain into purpose. When you've refused to let the world convince you that one voice, one choice, one moment couldn't change everything. Because it could. And it had. Ava heard Lucky's cry in a storm loud enough to silence the world. But here's my question for you. If you were driving that night, exhausted, off duty, desperate to get home, would you have stopped? Be honest. No judgment. Because the truth is, most of us drive past suffering every single day without even realizing it. We're tired, we're busy. We assume someone else will handle it. But what if no one else does? Ava was 10 years old. She had every reason to stay silent, grief, fear, exhaustion. But she didn't. She chose to speak, to insist, to act. Drop your answer below. I want to know what hope sounds like to you.